Um, all right. Let's get started right on time. Welcome everybody to our virtual roundtable. Today's topic is how to increase your return on investment and improve employee efficiency using M365 for records management. Before we officially begin the session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people on the call with us here today. So, before we jump in and I introduce our amazing panelists for the day, I'd like to just quickly touch on who we are at Engage Squared. We are a modern work Microsoft partner. Our mission is to make work better through technology. We provide end-to-end support for our clients across digital workplace, business applications, change management, and of course, information and records management as well. We really specialize in designing and building solutions that are suited to the unique needs of our clients using the latest and greatest features that are available within the Microsoft ecosystem. We're fortunate enough to work with some of the largest organizations across the APAC region. Some of our clients are on the call today. Welcome. It's lovely to see you all here. So we really understand the challenges that a lot of organizations face when it comes to modernizing how work is done in a secure and compliant way, particularly when it comes to the information and records landscape, which is notoriously complex. So here to share some wisdom with us all today are our speakers. Joining us from sunny Brisbane, we have Andrew Jolly, who is our information management and records management practice lead. We also have Stephen Monk, who is the CEO of Engage Squared. And we're also fortunate enough to be joined by some of our Microsoft colleagues today as well. We've got Dave Caddick, who is a senior security specialist at Microsoft, and Bo Fall, who is a technical security specialist at Microsoft. Before I pass over to the team, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Dave and Bo for joining us today. We're really appreciative of our close partnership with Microsoft, and also to both of you for taking the time to be part of today's conversation. Finally, from me, before I pass over to the team, I just really want to touch on the agenda for today. We'll be talking or giving you all a bit of an overview of Microsoft Purview. We'll be talking about E5 and also E3 license capabilities that you might not be aware of that you can be taking advantage of today. We'll share a customer story, and then we'll open up to the group for questions as well. So a few people submitted questions before the session. Thank you for doing that. We'll make sure to answer those when we get into our Q&A section. But as I mentioned at the start of the call, if you do have anything at all that you'd like to ask the panel that we have, please feel free to pop those questions in the chat and we'll get to it as soon as we can. So that's enough from me. I'll pass over to Bo.
Thank you very much. Is it all right if I take control?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to be giving a holistic overview on what Purview is, rather than just focusing on just the records management side. A lot of the time when we're speaking to customers, it gets very siloed. So they're only focused on information protection or data loss prevention or records management. A lot of the time we need to broaden out that view. So think of something like Defender keeping the bad things out of your environment. With Purview, we're focused on trying to keep those good things in. So we're trying to focus on that. What I will quickly do is I'll step forward through an overall architecture of kind of what is in Purview, just so you get a good understanding on how these things fit together and how they can also help benefit your records management solution. So underlying the entire service, we have the data classification service. This is where we start speaking about some of that automatic labeling capabilities. So we've got sensitive information types, which are essentially pattern matches where we can look for particular types of information, credit cards, social security numbers, licenses, that sort of thing. We've got custom queries, so you can do your own regexes, you can do your own dictionary searches, and we also have trainable classifiers. They're essentially a machine learning model. You feed it information, it learns what that information looks like. You can then use that to start automatically classifying content. That feeds through to a couple of things. So we have sensitivity labels, and that's under the information protection side of things. So that's where we look at classifying our data, applying encryption, building out that. We also have it when it comes to records management and retention labels. So for example, we could say, if we find a credit card in our environment, we want to mark it highly confidential, encrypted, and then hold that for 3 years and then run a disposition review. That process can be automated, so you don't need to go through and manually label all of this content. And Andrew will talk about that a little bit later. We also have this labeling extends out to things like Exchange, to Teams, to SharePoint. It works for Windows, Mac OS, iOS, and Android, so we can extend those out over those different platforms. And we can also extend that out to on-premises. So we can extend information protection labels to on-prem, as well as our data loss prevention capabilities, all through that one Purview stack. We also reach out into third-party SaaS solutions, so things like Dropbox, ServiceNow, to put some protective controls in there with Defender for Cloud applications. And we also extend data loss prevention outside of 365 into things like endpoint DLP for your endpoint devices. That's essentially an agentless data loss prevention service, so you don't need to manage third-party agents on those platforms. And we can also put those controls across onto Microsoft Teams. So we make sure we're not sharing that sensitive information where we shouldn't be. We've got protective controls on. Maybe we have a sensitivity label on a team where we don't invite guests into it because it's confidential. We can build out those capabilities as well. We also have the data catalog side of Purview. This extends this out into the Azure or cloud services side of things. Think of things like SQL databases, AWS S3 buckets. We can extend these sensitivity labels and sensitive information types across so that you have that holistic data classification sensitivity part across your entire environment. And finally, the last couple of things I'll briefly touch on now is we have eDiscovery Premium. So that's essentially where we can do things like searching for particular information, might be a subject's rights request. Maybe we've got some legal case that we need to export things out to a third party or to HR. That's the service we use there. And then we've also got insider risk management and communications compliance, which is essentially, I almost call it the SIEM for M365. It correlates all of the telemetry across your 365 stack. So if people are doing anomalous behavior, if they're accessing things they shouldn't be accessing, if they're copying information out the environment that they shouldn't be, insider risk management will pick that up and scan it for you. So you can highlight alerts, do automated response, and communications compliance effectively manages the sentiment across conversations. Maybe you want to detect harassment across your communication platform so you can get ahead of it. We're allowed to do that with comms compliance. You can do things like self-reporting. You can build out things looking for sensitive information across your communication channels. And that effectively works for things like Teams, for Exchange, for third-party services. It can connect into things like WhatsApp, for example. So the good thing to think about when you talk about Purview is we're not purely focused on it just from a Microsoft perspective. We have a lot of third-party data connectors to hook into third-party platforms and start managing and controlling information there as well. We want to be that central holistic data view across your estate. We don't want to just be focused on one or two small bits. And with that, I might hand it back over to Andrew if there's no other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Bo. Yeah, I've got one eye on the chat thing, so please do if you have even just a keyword you might want to hear more about, just definitely pop it in there. We kind of made sure that today we allocated time to answer those questions should they come through, but we also had a backup of a few key topics we thought you might be interested in, and we can start there. So do feel free to interrupt
just
as much as you
quick,
like.
Just as a quick housekeeping piece,
Yeah,
Bo and ourselves aren't going to be around to right to the end. We've got a couple of hard stops on a couple of other things. So, but please, folks, if you do have questions, if you do leave them till later, that's fine, because we'll hook back up with Andrew and the team to get through to those if we need to. All right.
Great. So when just in coming up with this so as you saw with Bo's slide, there's so much in that suite, and we don't want to I always don't like to overload people with things. So I thought I'd just cherry pick a few things to lay out here, but also in line with ROI, like return on investment. So what do we mean by that? So many of you have already adopted or gone to an E5 licensing level. Some of you might be considering it, and that's good. There's lots there to be gained. We often find that people go to the E5 level of licensing because there was one driver that got them there, like it might have been threat protection or something, or some sort of defender sort of angle, and then sign up for licensing, and lo and behold, there's all this extra stuff that that is there just waiting to be explored and utilized. Some of it might take a little bit of time to implement, but some of it's actually quite immediate. Some of it can be quite effective immediately and with very little outlay in terms of time and resources. So it's really much a journey you can go on. Bo, that's do you find that's did Bo just drop off? I think he.
No, I'm still here.
You're there. That was something I think we discussed. That you see that a bit, don't you? Where people sort of they come in buying the E5 uplift from one angle, and then there's this there's all this other stuff that people might not be aware of. Yeah, that's the
exactly. And that's why we kind of try to have that holistic conversation, because people might just be focused on information protection and data loss prevention, for example. But when you do move up to the E5 license, you get so much more capability in there that you need to be aware of, so you can take advantage of that investment.
Great, yeah. So the first, the sort of the small handful of key capabilities that I thanks for posting in the message there. Great, thanks, Dean. We've got those questions. I'll pop those. We'll address those shortly. Yeah, thanks. So auto apply, I think that's for those that aren't aware. I like to think the difference between E3 and those level licensing to E5 is that things become automatic once you hit E5. So if you want to do automated application of retention labels or sensitivity labels, that's the sort of the E5 advantage, I think. Of course, there's manual labeling in that E3 area, and that's okay. It's just that auto apply is definitely, that's the key capability that's in the box there when you start to get into E5 level. That's both for retention labels that can be auto applied. So, keep anything with asbestos written in it for 70 years, that can be automatically applied if it detects that word, asbestos, or the other technical words for that illness, for example. Also sensitivity labeling. So I know a lot of people are starting to take moves into that direction. It's very related to records management, sensitivity. I think we start seeing them as peas in a pod. The sensitivity labeling can be also automatically applied based on what it detects in those in the content that's there. Default labeling as well. So when we talk about default labeling, that's the ability to put default labels on a library, for example, in SharePoint, and also a sensitivity label can also now be default configured in a library as well. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, you might be working in a particular library around a particular project. It just needs one. It always needs the same retention label. It always needs the same sensitivity label. That's the tool set that can make that easier for people to work with when they're operating in those libraries. The other key capability there is disposition. A lot of records managers and IM people know that term. So what do you do at the end of a life cycle of that sunset period for a document? What do you do with it? Do you delete it? Do you extend its retention? Do you transfer it somehow? Do you just, do you delete it, destroy it? Disposition review is an E5 feature. Sometimes it's talked about quite a lot. Sometimes it's confused that it's an E3, but it's E3 licensing does have retention of things, but it's sort of a more, the choice at the end is either do nothing with the item or delete it. There's not a sort of a disposition review. So disposition is there in that E5 side of things. This isn't so much I wanted to raise this one, Bo, because it wasn't so much an E5 thing, but I did think it was really useful and something that not so much an ROI thing, but I do think ROI in general. If any of you are working towards putting some encryption on documents that have been labeled with, say, protected in the government space, think about your protected label, then previously the co-authoring wasn't doable with that, because the encryption puts some pretty tight things on the documents. So co-authoring was not, editing at the same time was not really supported. There's now a button in Admin Center. You can make this change wholesale, and it will allow the co-authoring experience with encrypted documents. So something really good, something very, very important to consider when starting to implement information protection in conjunction with labels, sensitivity labels. So that was just my kind of top sort of main four, and I know a lot of people would know about those, but I just wanted to tell people who hadn't explored or understood those from an E5 capability point of view what they were. Thanks, Alistair. Yes, maintaining metadata. We'll talk about that real quick then. So Alice has popped a question in the chat there about retaining of metadata. There is when you do dispose of content out of when you perform a disposal, there is an Excel. You can export a collection of metadata that tells you what was disposed. Now, when I say a collection of metadata, it's a defined collection of metadata. It's about 5 properties, I think. Sort of the URL to the item, the name of the item, who disposed of it. I might have been who created it or something, and who modified it, who disposed of it, and the date of disposition. So it's metadata that proves disposition of those items. The question we often get is, well, what about all the other metadata on the item? And that's a good question. Some of that may need to be retained. Some of it might not need to be retained because some of that metadata could actually be classified as content that you don't want hanging around in an e-discovery if they were to find that later on. So it's a sort of a 2-part answer, Alistair. There is evidence of what was disposed. The grey area is what level of metadata is kept. If that's needed, we've done a few little examples of where we've created sort of Azure logic apps to extract more metadata out prior to hitting the disposition button. So there are ways to get sort of a more comprehensive set of metadata out there if that's what you need. And we would export that stuff into little JSON files and they become searchable and all that sort of thing. So it's sort of a 2-part answer. It might not be the perfect answer that people are looking for, but it's certainly doable. Yeah, great, thanks. New capabilities, I just grabbed 2. It's funny, there's actually a what's new page for this, and yes, you're smiling, Bo, because you know what I'm going to say. And it's I thought, oh, look at that, maybe I'll show it on the screen, but it's just them and 2 or 3 scrolls of new stuff in the last couple of months. So, but I was just, a lot of it's quite fine-grained, and I don't want to bore everyone of that today. We want to stay at a higher level. But 2 things I think that is useful is the administrative units side of things, Bo. I think that was one that you immediately thought as well the other day when we chatted. That one allows a Purview administrator to, people administering Purview to be able to share the responsibility for managing some of the capabilities that are there. And so, sorry, the labels and so on. So that's a great set of features, because especially organizations that might have offices in other countries and your rules might be a little different in the different jurisdictions, possibly even government agencies who are sharing a tenant. I know there's probably a few of you on the call today that might be in that situation. Some of you might need different labeling, and you might have different people managing those sorts of configurations. So something to be aware of and know about. This is unfortunately it's not GA yet, but this was something in preview, and I think it's relevant because it was. Did I just move forward there? It was the PDF support for auto labeling. So that's auto sensitivity labeling. It looks like that's in the pipes and coming along, and I do get that question asked a lot, because when you have the auto labeling from E5, it'll auto label things like the Excel, PowerPoint, Word. That's fine. When it comes to PDFs, that's a different story, and Adobe's actually done quite a few steps towards making sensitive labels pickable inside Adobe, which is great. But this next step from Microsoft is bringing that auto labeling into PDFs that are sitting inside libraries. So that's a good win, I think, all round, and hopefully that won't spend too long in preview, and we'll get to see that coming on stream soon. I'll just check the list. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, for a master tenant architecture, the administrative units is a really key feature. Yeah, I know there was a lot of demand for that, and I think it's good to see it's finally there. The other, Dean, I'll get to yours in a second. I think we popped a question or 2 on that came from you earlier on the slide, so thanks for sending those through earlier. Other benefits, I thought I'd just think about a couple of other things that sit outside the E5 in the E5 world that aren't necessarily record specific, but they are information management related. The number one is in Microsoft Purview, there's an area called the Compliance Center. Gives you a bunch of reports and scores about how well your environment is set up on a number of fronts. there are a whole suite, possibly around 300, I think, premium assessment templates. So what is an assessment template? So for example, if there's a bunch of Australian ones, let's pretend there's one called Australia PII. You can enable that. It'll have about 300 or 400 checkpoints in it, and you can sort of self-assess and against those checkpoints provide evidence, sort of test yourself against that, effectively marking yourself off and giving yourself ultimately contributing to a score. Now, what's really nice about that is there are ones for different records management standards. I think VERS has one in there, which is great for the Melbourne Victoria record standard. They've got one in there, and lots of other Australian financial and health as well. I think health is in there, I think. But they're a great way of tracking your progress and giving you some sort of bearing on where you're at, and you'll see a number that starts to increase as time goes on. Now with E5, those templates, I think you're entitled to 3 of those. Is that right, Bo and Dave? I think it's 3. Sometimes I read 4.
Yeah.
But
no,
I think
you can pick your 3. You get a data protection baseline template as part of your. It's just out of the box. You get it straight away, but you can pick whatever 3 that you want.
Yeah, perfect. So the 3, depending on your regulatory need, or maybe you're subject to oversight by a government body. If you're in a private sector, you might have you might choose the 3 that matter to you. Maybe it's the financial protection stuff or personal identifiable information. And they become tool sets where you can sort of look at them. Now, normally without E5, they're around about 6,000 a year, I think, 500 a month. And you might think, oh, that sounds a bit, but what Microsoft do is actually maintain those assessment templates. So they're not just, here's a template. It's not a static Word document. It's actually online. It's got an interface and everything. In fact, I was in the tenant yesterday and I noticed a message on mine saying there's been an update and do you want to push the button to pull it all down? So that's what you're sort of paying for. You're paying for those, or you're getting, if you're E5, you're getting those assessment templates regularly updated. And they're really good use of a really good feature to help you get like a feeling for where you are and what improvements you can make. So if you haven't seen those, I'd encourage you to ask the people that manage, say, Microsoft Purview under the hood, ferret them out. If you don't know who they are already in your organization, we can help you there. And have a discussion about those, because sometimes they are aware of them. They're not aware of how they can be used for information management, information governance, records management. Yeah. And this one's kind of a little outlier, but this was a little E5 nugget that I came across the other day. With Microsoft Search, you've got the ability to index other sources of content through a Microsoft connector, Graph connector. Now, Graph is kind of like the sister of the search index, I like to sometimes call it, or the big sister now. It's essentially used in conjunction with the search, Microsoft Search, to sort of bring results up and return the results to the user. Now, to put other when we index other sources, let's say we're going to index your public-facing websites, right? Let's say you want to bring your public-facing website for your organization, bring results into the user's day-to-day experience in Microsoft Search. So that's doable. And it can be done using the Microsoft Graph connectors. Now, the graph needs a quota of sort of extra rows in there. Now, if you're on E3, the buy quota, I think it's around $1,500 a month for about 1.5 million rows. My numbers might be a little off there, but it's around that much. 1.5 million rows. There's a lot of rows, I think. But depending on how many data sources you're indexing. But let's just go with our example of a website, okay, public-facing website. If you're E5, there is an entitlement of 500 rows per licensed user under E5. So if you're an organization of someone get their calculator out, before you know it, you might have quite a few, you might have 50,000, 70,000 spare rows ready to be used to index an external data source. That's just part of your E5 entitlement. So I think it's again, it's not part of the Purview stuff, but I did discover that and thought, oh, that's a winner, because I know a lot of people often see it and think it's a costed thing. So just wanted to throw that one out there, because I feel like it's a great way of exploring and expanding your environment to give a much better user experience. Now, some of those connectors, I'll try and rattle a few off. I think there's definitely one to index a website. generic one. There are some to index file shares. It does require an agent on a server, and you can limit how much it brings back, by the way, so you won't have to bring back 3 million results in one go. There's connectors to ServiceNow. A lot of you probably are ServiceNow users. There's a connector there. There's connectors for Atlassian if you're Confluence users, or Jira users. I believe there's one for that. That's great. We ourselves aren't Jira users. We use Azure DevOps, but there's a connector for that. So we bring our tasks and our bits and pieces in our DevOps sort of back end actually come through and get surfaced in our search results, which is really great. You get to find things that people are building on different projects that we work on just because I'm using search. So you can kind of see that's where it kind of all works. So I just wanted to highlight that one. Bo, hopefully you're still around for a few more minutes. Any other things there that you would add to that dance card if you were to call anything out? Or Dave?
I think like even when we're starting to speak about records management, and it is key, a lot of the time that combination should be combined with the information classification conversation, right? So when we start speaking about records management capabilities, we should be tying those two things together, because if you have that holistic data map across your estate, so if I know I need to retain something for 70 years, typically that's going to be, I know what classification is associated with that. So you do have the ability to automate that labeling for both of those two different areas. So just keep that in mind. Past that, I think it's just the more that you can get in, the more automation we put in place, the less onerous behavior we need to enforce on our users, the better it's going to be. If we can manage this stuff in place without people having to pick up data, move it somewhere else, a really big manual process, including the application of that label, the more secure and the better retention policies we're going to have.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's a good point to underscore it. A lot of Microsoft investment seems to be that automation side of it, improving that. And I know that you have loads of NDA stuff, but I get the vibe that that some of that auto classification will even get even better with recent developments in the LLM world. So that's very, very exciting, that I think. So it is about removing that burden from users, because they're not records managers, they're not experts. And I think you put someone on the spot and they will say, I'm not sure what this is, so I don't want to choose the wrong category. And that's admirable, right? That's okay. I understand that pain point. Another pain point is, I've got too many things to select. I'm busy. I'm just going to put this on my desktop, right? So again, I understand they're busy, and everyone's busy. Feels like everyone's super busy post-COVID. Just feels like it's all crazy. And then and I think those are the things that people are faced with, and they're not going to learn a classification system. And even if they did, it wouldn't stick for very long. Right?
Hesitancy comes in as well. So you'll find, if it is too complicated, a user will either select the most stringent labels that you have just in case, or they'll select the least stringent to make their life easier.
Yeah, it's either that, it's that swing, isn't it? It's never in the middle. Yeah, and or if there's a miscellaneous term, they'll grab that. But we don't encourage miscellaneous in any metadata properties. Disclaimer. No, it's good. It's a good point. So so I think the automation is a really important point. I know that a lot of customers we do talk to sometimes are a little I wouldn't say anxious, but it's like they don't know how that's going to work, right? They don't know, will it be a robot that's overzealous, or will it be just completely dumb and only classify one thing out of 1,000? And I think the only way you can really answer that is to try things out, right? And to isolate a little corner of your environment, as I often say, and just kind of work on some real world examples of that, because Purview is there. It's not, you don't have to deploy Purview. It's there under the covers. I like to say it's underneath your 365, kind of like with its hands like that. It's there, it's on. It's just about configuration of it. And so it's possible to do quite discrete little tests and little evaluations and work on things. And actually you do need to do it in that real world content, because if you try and do it in a dev environment, well, it's not the content and there's nothing in it, and it's very hard to sort of even assess. But you can easily do it in a confined way, and then tweak it and retract it if you don't want to do it that way. So I think Purview's got that flexibility that people can do that, those sorts of activities and experiments with. Yeah.
It's probably worth noting as well that with these automatic policies, you can simulate it. So you can turn it on and say, what would this have picked up after I've done my scan across the environment? So you don't have to push something straight into prod and worry there's going to be some sort of impact in there. We typically recommend simulate it first, see what it's going to pick up. If it is accurate, roll it out. If it is not, tune your policy a little bit more and then simulate it again.
Actually, that was probably one of the new capabilities that I probably should have dropped on there, was because that, I mean, that's about 6 months, maybe, actually, I don't know, time's a blur with the last.
There's just so much that's happened over the last 6 months.
But I think that previewing the simulation wasn't always there, and it's there now, and it's great. So I think that's definitely, that definitely will help people who are trying to learn and take that journey, that take that next step. Because this is a purview, you saw from Beau's slide, it's massive. So don't be overwhelmed, because everybody is, right? So you're not overwhelmed. You're probably not looking at it hard enough. So you should be overwhelmed. But the way forward is not to try and read all about it and then take the plunge. It's about putting that toe in the water and doing some experiments and moving forward. Yeah, I think so. That's a good little takeaway. In fact, that's probably a good segue to the next slide. Dean, we'll get to your slide and get your questions in a minute, because I did actually paste them on a slide. So yeah. Now, this was I just sort of summarized. So on that sort of idea of going on a little journey, taking steps toward preparing yourselves, educating yourselves. A recent exercise we did with one of our customers. They were actually 5 departments with a shared IT service provider. Now, I don't know how many people on the call are in that situation, but in this example, that it was sort of that central IT provider. So they weren't as close to the standard organization as you would hope, right? So it's sort of there's a bit of bridging to be made there, right? So the situation was there was large government agency, so 5 usages of that tenant, right? So as you can imagine, the administrative units could become very useful when configuring for different people's needs. So I hope they evaluate that soon. They do already have an EDRMS. It's okay if you've got the question here is not, do I throw out my old EDRMS and do Purview? The question is, what do you want to do, right? Because it's possible to integrate those in many cases. It's possible to just run them side by side and work on a different process for identifying high value content and harvesting it in there or what have you. So remember, it's not always a case of throwing out old systems. It's just recognizing that there's multiple systems of record, and that's okay. It's just the modern way. These agencies wanted to improve the coverage and control of that content. So there was plenty in that EDRMS, but there was a whole world of content, as you all will know on the call today in your environments. There's tons of stuff, and it's not moving into the other environments by itself, right? It's normally requiring people to lift it and move it into an EDRMS. So that's a problem. There was stuff that wasn't managed and retained and not the right protection. So the idea was to increase that coverage, right? Initially, there was a limited understanding of Purview, and there was a need to empower the different organization parts for information management tasks. So the solution there, how we helped them out, was to educate on the capabilities of Purview first. So that was a lot of jumping on screens together, showing and telling, running a few little examples and experiments. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot to learn, but it's important that everyone got that sort of sense of, okay, I now understand key concepts, because it can be a little difficult to wrap your head around some things to begin with. And then introducing the concepts of retention versus retention labeling, auto apply, things we mentioned before. And then doing some knowledge transfer, making sure people have got those skills, getting them access. And I think that was probably the biggest outcome here. We did actually help them configure some testing and some labeling, and with a rolled up set of labels to commence with. But the most important thing I think that they got out of it was this ability that to access Purview as information managers and records managers. So before the engagement, it was very much an IT tool. Oh, it's Purview, it's IT's tool. Well, actually, it's not IT's tool. There's 56 roles in that tool set, and some of them say legal people, some say records managers. And the important thing is to give people the tools that they need to do their jobs and everyone be confident about that, right? I know that's a little bit unnerving for some organizations, but there are enough protections in there for that to be done safely and with a lot of auditing as well. Pretty much you can't sneeze without it being added to the audit log, it seems, in the e-discovery, in the Purview backend, everything's kind of logged. So if anyone's worried about people doing the wrong things, it's very transparent as to who's doing what and where and how and why. Yeah, so I thought just to frame that up, that's the type of thing we do get involved with organizations. We know that different organizations are ready to move ahead on their journey at different rates. Some people have done a lot of background research. Some people already have their sensitivity labels in and they want to adjust them. We're working with clients who do that. Some don't have sensitivity labels, don't really know what they can do with them. They're at a different point. So and the same with records management as well. So sometimes it's we're very used to talking to people at different stages of their life cycle and journey there. Oh, we'll just check the question board. Good. No, we're good. All right. Any questions? Yeah. Any questions? Anyone want to? Or feel free to come off mute. Can they do that, Steph? I don't know if they can do that. Can they? Can they come off mute by themselves? I'm not sure.
Yeah, they should be able to.
Oh, they should be able to do that. Oh, yeah. You can mic bomb it if you want. Yeah. Cool. While people are thinking, maybe if there's anything else there, I'll just this was a sample of what
Sorry,
came out
AJ,
of.
Sarah's got her hand
Sarah.
up.
Yeah. Do you want to pitch the question out, Sarah, or do you want to type it in the chat? What would you prefer?
Happy to talk.
Yeah, great.
Question about the retention labels.
Yeah, sure.
How, it's probably more from a change management perspective for the records managers who come from a multi-leveled classification scheme. How did they go with rolling up those retention levels to a single layer?
It's probably the best and hardest question you can ask, Sarah, so thank you for doing it. But it is probably the hardest thing of all. Like it really is. Like and it's something that you have to work together with. We work together with them to do. There's no sort of one size fits all. I know that sounds like I'm sitting on the fence, but there's no sort of, oh, this is the roll up records for the NAA, or this is the roll up records for VERS. Like there's not really a sort of a fixed way of doing it. So the key to it, though, is to take a sort of a risk-based approach to it. So you have to look at your retention disposal authority, and you might have. Do you know how many classes you have in yours, Sarah? Are you aware of that? Do you know how many?
I know there
categories?
Can be multiples. If you look
Hundreds?
at AdFor Express, it's not too
bad.
It's
not too bad.
Others,
yep.
Yeah.
Others can be
massive.
lengthy. Yeah. I think I found a post online recently and a university had a blog. I was just searching for things and up came this article, and it was a Melbourne University, one of them, and they'd said they were very happy to explain that they'd done a rolled up record strategy and it took them 2 years and they'd gone from 3,000 terms to something like 400 or something like that, which, I mean, 400 is still a lot, Yeah. So it is hard to do. I think what the key is that it's a healthy dose of saying, what's an acceptable amount of time that we can sort of use bigger buckets to sort of group things under. And I feel like if you can get to sort of 15-ish or something like that, you're doing it incredibly well. But even 30 is awesome. And normally we would, if it's, I don't like, if it's manual applying that people are doing, don't really like to go beyond, say, 15 types of labels. If it's any more than that, I'd probably start looking at auto apply and using other metadata techniques to do that as well, so that they're classifying with metadata and then acting on that metadata classifier. I know that's a big ask to go from that much to that little. The biggest question we do get, though, is that non-compliant? That's what we hear, and people are seem to be afraid of the boogeyman and state records. But it's like, actually, you talk to state records, they're really, really good about it. They're like, oh yeah, rolled up record strategies are fine. And all the state records I've talked to, they'll say that, but they'll also then say, as long as you've done a risk-based assessment of it and that you've determined an acceptable retention period and that you can actually review at any time and then refine that retention period. So there's definitely ways of doing it. It's just not as easy as people think it is to just quickly sort of pinpoint them and then implement them. I'm not sure if that answered the question very well, Sarah, but
yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, there's definitely some it's definitely a different set of techniques to trying to sort of come up with something that's going to work sort of en masse, at least to protect yourselves from losing something too early. There's definitely a risk of keeping things too long, 100%. Like, so it's sort of working out where those risks lie in your business, because what's risky for one organization, I've talked to some organizations and I say, do you get many RFIs for this? And they're like, oh my God, like 20 a week. And then you talk to another organization for the same sort of staff and they'll go, never had an RFI for that. And so you're looking for what you can see there is a different risk profile on how much attention you might have to pay to whether those things are classified with the exact amount of time that you need that you're allowed to retain them for. Because in organization B over here, they don't really get, so they don't get a lot of RFIs for that specific content I mentioned example. Then to hold it a bit longer in a bigger bucket retention sort of period is probably okay, before they do anything about it. But for the other organization who's getting a lot of these, and it's good to get rid of it after the number of years they're allowed to, then you'd be a bit more explicit with the labeling you'd go forward with there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's that idea of a risk-based ideology when you go into doing rolled up strategies. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of info online about doing all this. So, but I think stuff's coming now. You see more people talk about it, and more people kind of understand how it might have to apply. But we might have to apply these principles a lot more often in this space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you for asking that. It's great. I'm glad we threw it around. It's probably just ignited about 700 other questions in people's minds. So we could be here a while. Yeah. Good. Excellent. So this slide here, I just sort of dragged this out because I thought this was a good example of just some of the complexities that you have with Purview around, but some of the security that you get with Purview. So down the left-hand side is all these sort of essential and little blue highlights there, lots of light blue boxes around those features. Those are kind of like what we would normally say is the key sort of records type functionality that a records manager is probably going to need, as likely, at least those are the minimum, which is data classification, the audit logging, access to the audit logs. They can do queries in there to see when they're asked to do those. Content search is like that's not search like SharePoint search, everyone. That's like a query on all the data in 365. It actually churns away to get the results and then sort of shows you like a saved sort of search report of those. So it's a bit more than just a search. It's more like a big query. That's useful if you're trying to look for things, patterns for things, or trying to see where you've got content that hasn't been classified or is at risk. That's a really good feature set. Data lifecycle management, that's around the label policies and retention, not retention labeling, but the broad brushstroke retention that you can put on SharePoint or groups or what have you. And the last one there is the records management set of capabilities, which includes disposition for people with E5. So these ones here, if you logged in as a records manager with these permissions all set up, you'd just see those blue things. You wouldn't see all the rest. So it just shows you how Purview can be very fine-tuned. And to give you those permissions, that's where all these sort of purple roles are. So you actually need to be a records manager, and you don't just need records management, you actually need what we encourage people to consider is making sure you give people those purple rows there. I'm pointing at my screen like this. Those purple rows there, purple boxes, because those permission sets combine to give you that capability. And that's really useful for the IT folk to know about, because they're like, oh, okay, I can really give my RMIM people what they need without sort of, giving them access to other things they shouldn't have. So it's definitely possible to get the right people to the right tool set to begin that journey, to begin that learning. And I certainly would encourage people to do that. We're always happy to have a call if you want to talk about that more, and you feel free to bring the IT people if you want to talk about that some more. Because often this isn't quite clear to people that this is available. They don't know that it's able to be quite granularly permissioned, and if that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, cool. Okay, jump to some questions. This is the one that I promised I'd answer for Dean. Now, how can I classify or apply sensitive labels to non-Microsoft applications and media. So videos and audios and PDFs. Very good question. That is, I just saw that one, Colin. Thanks for that. We might be able to screen share something if we have time. But but that first one there around non-sensitive labels, sensitive labels to non-Microsoft apps information. So sensitivity labels are actually a standard that is quite old. It's been in the IT realm for a long time. It was known as information rights management. Some of you might remember that. So it's kind of a standard that other file format makers and producers and so on actually have implemented. I believe you can even put a sensitivity label on a TIFF file, right? So, but the question there, and probably question you're asking, Dean, is how do I do that? Because there's not really an interface to do that in a TIFF viewer or in Microsoft. There's not really a button to do that, unless, now that I'm thinking about it, unless it can be done through the default sensitive labels. But what Microsoft have for that use, though, is they do have the ability to do that using the AIP Unified Labeling Client. Now, some of you, it's a little piece of software that drops into the onto computers. You will read that it is deprecated, although it sort of still plays a role in this space. So I feel like it's deprecated. I think what they mean to say is that AIP app is, I'll try and find a link for everyone, that AIP client is deprecated in terms of classifying Word documents in Excel, and because it's inbuilt now into the client applications for Word and Excel and PowerPoint, but it's and it's in the web versions as well. But I still think it still plays a role if you need it for things like video or any of those other supported file types that take sensitivity labeling. Yeah, so I think that's kind of I'll just grab you guys a link. Azure Unified Labeling Client. I think just put to the download, because I think you can end up in some strange locations with this one. So I'll just grab you the Microsoft download. So yeah, so please, if you do read this and think, oh, it's deprecated, just keep an open mind, because I think it's not as deprecated as people think it is. Yeah, definitely got some usages. Now I'll just paste that into the chat. That's the it's one of the Microsoft things. It's not the one I wanted for you all. Maybe this one. Cool. I'll find that. The second question there, just to the right of that speech bubble, is how do you apply sensitive labels to specific location in SPO, SharePoint Online? Now, it's a really good question. I'll probably have to answer it in two parts. Number one, something I can answer now. Number two, I really want to do an experiment now and I won't be able to do it on the call. So, but what I want to say here is that there's, if you're E5 users, you can configure a sensitivity label, a default sensitivity label for a library, in a library location. You actually go to the library settings, you drop down the settings, and then the setting is in there, and it lets you pick one of the ones that you're entitled to apply. So that's kind of interesting, because what it means is that then anyone else is just dropping files in will get that label assigned. Now, my second part of the experiment I want to do, and I will come back to you, Dean, on this, is I want to pop a few file formats in a library and that I know can accept a sensitivity label, and see if that applies to those as well. So yeah, I'll have to get you to watch this space on that one. I've not experienced. I'd like to say it does, but then at the same time, Microsoft tech needs to know how to write to the properties sort of definition of that particular file type, and I just want to make sure that's what it can do to all the known file types. So yeah, I'll try and provide an answer to that. Maybe I'll get an answer to that, Claudia and Steph, and we can push a note out to everyone on the call once I've sorted it out. There's commitment for you. Last question there, how can I delegate admin rights to different people in my organization? Yeah, so that slide before that I sort of showed around those, that's that's how you do it. I think that's what you're getting at. Different people can be given those different roles, and they can actually be given quite narrow roles as well. Like I've seen some people with so legal, like for example, a legal department. You might actually allow your legal people to do their own kind of queries, because why bother? Most legal people actually have done this sort of thing before. They're very good at research. They were certainly trained about it at universities, I know, and they're good at e-discovery, a lot of them. So it would be sort of inefficient to have sometimes it's inefficient to have, say, a legal person on staff actually have to go through IT to try and get a report out, when they can do it self-serve, do it themselves, and have that all logged by the system anyway. So you can even get alerted if you're worried about how they're using it. Okay, so in that example, you'd be able to give them access to just the content search capability, the ability to perform a content search. There's even another tweak to that role, which means in fact, it's the last one at the very bottom of that stack. Can you see that one at the bottom? It says Content Explorer, Content Viewer. So it's actually possible for someone to query and get a list of file names, but not be able to preview the files. So that's an interesting notion as well. So that's how granular you can get it, and you can distribute it to the rights to different people in the organization. I hope that answered the question there, Colin. No, was it Colin? Who answered that one? The bottom there box. Maybe it wasn't you, Colin. Sorry, Colin. Putting questions in your mouth. Yeah, cool. There's one at the bottom there. Cool, thanks. About data lifecycle management differ between records management. So yes, so data lifecycle management is a heading that offers a bunch of features, and I'm just going to grab my notes on this. I've got a demo environment that I'll make sure I'm telling you the right things. Data lifecycle management includes things like what we call like retention policies, which are not the same as labels. Retention labels are put out using retention label policies, but there's also retention policies. I know it's confusing. The retention policies just talk about like every say, I'll give you an example. So all of our Teams chats, let's keep them at least for 2 years, and then at the end of 2 years we do nothing. So we don't worry if someone deletes it after 2 years. Or conversely, you could say we keep all the Teams chats for 2 years because they're just messaging, and we've deemed that acceptable risk to keep them for 2 years, and then we can delete them. That's also an option. Now, I don't know many people who like to hit the delete button a lot of the time on their retention policies, but we probably do need to start thinking a bit more about that as information management people, because part of the recent sorry, I'm getting to that information lifecycle question. Part of the recent problem with a lot of those breaches, and I don't know all the details with those big high-profile Medibanks and Optuses and all that stuff, but what was very common to the media was that there was people's data that was kept for a very long time, even though they were no longer a customer of those organizations, sometimes 5 and 6 years later. In fact, I was one of those with Medibank. I haven't been a customer with them for 9 years, and I was in that dump. So that if we can get rid of things, and we're allowed to get rid of things, and we've assessed the risk of not having them, if we get rid of them, and we've tabled that risk, and we can tell an auditor that's our decision, and that's normally what you have to do to get a tick, then it makes sense to get rid of things if you don't need to keep them any longer, particularly stuff with personally identifiable information in it. So that's an easy statement to make. I know it's harder than it seems, but yeah, that's normally the position there. Now, where's my compliance center here? Here it is. Information lifecycle management versus I might even share my screen for the last 5 minutes, if that's all right, or and throw your questions out there if you need to. If there's something that you'd like to just pose and we can address it, I don't mind addressing it afterwards either, so feel free to do that. Right, so data lifecycle management I will share. How about that? I'll open up those blades for you so we can see what's in them. Come on, there it is. And oh no, that's the wrong screen. Let's have a look. Hold on a minute. Wrong screen. Stop sharing. Oh, just killed the call, didn't I? Yep,
You're all
no.
good, AJ.
Oh, okay. I've managed to just kill the call, but oh no, I'm still here, but I've killed
Yep.
the screen. I'll try one more time. As I've got the little menu open here, we can have a quick look at it. So
We have 4 minutes left. So if anyone does have any
yeah,
final
feel free.
questions, pop them in the chat. If we can't get through it now, we'll definitely answer it later on.
Yeah, great. So this is just, I've just opened up, you can see that, Claudia and folk? Good?
Yep.
Yep, cool. So I've just opened up that data lifecycle management heading, and inside of it, I've just clicked on the Microsoft 365 one, and it covers the retention policies, which I mentioned are not specific to records management. They protect your content from inadvertent deletion or intentional deletion. That's how I like to think about retention policies. They're going to stop things disappearing for the amount of time you say. Labels is more about records or sort of retention labels. Label policies is how long we're going to is pushing out those labels and sets. Adaptive scopes is how we can write sort of queries that determine where things are and then apply labels based on that. So if you're using a specific naming convention for SharePoint site URLs or for Teams, that can be really useful. And the same with metadata on items as well. And then the records management feature set, I'll just jump in here real quick. This one more centers on things like, as you can see, it's kind of navigation buttons to the same places, but file plan, so administering the file plan side of records management, which is not your typical file plan that many of you are used to. It's actually more of a virtual file plan, because if you remember, records stay in place in SharePoint. There's sort of the controls is placed on the content where it lives. So how they manifest in the file plan is how you would like to see them in a file plan. So the labels sort of are represented in a file plan, even though the content is still staying wherever it was in SharePoint. So it sort of abstracts the file plan from a physical, logical file plan. Label policies, adaptive scopes, and then event-driven retention. Bo mentioned this earlier in the call. It's a little bit tricky to set up. You need to be quite specific and organized with your metadata to do that, but it is doable for things like, if someone has a termination date or a contract end date, those sorts of events, you can actually configure the application of a label when that happens. And then finally, the disposition. This one's probably the one I spoke about earlier. So this is how you would go through and when things have hit their 7 or 8 years life cycle, 10 years, whatever, they turn up in here. You can get alerts as well, and they explain like this is the stuff that's awaiting disposition. It's usually organized by label type, and then a label, and then you click on that, and then you can manage the process through that. Yeah. And then finally, Dean, I just had this open. This is the little app for the information protection viewer. So it's if it isn't something that can be labeled through Microsoft's interfaces, this is a little app here where you can find a file and place a classification on it, and view those files and so on. So yeah, so it's not dead yet, but it is it's sort of fading out, but it is there if people still need it to classify things with sensitivity labels that can't be done through Microsoft software, and as long as it's a supported format that can be classified. Yeah, cool. All right, I'll stop presenting there.
Thank you, AJ.
I'll check the chat box, see if we've got anything else, and then otherwise I will do those little actions and part 2 of that experiment. I'm interested myself.
Sarah,
and then
you come off mute. No. Don't have a question? All good?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Oh, okay, great. I saw your hand up, so just thought I'd check. Awesome. We're bang on midday, so in Melbourne anyway. So thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully that was hugely informative. It certainly was for me. You can see AJ knows his stuff when it comes to information and records management and Purview and everything that's available to you in M365. Steph has put some really useful links in the chat, so definitely download our white paper if you haven't already. Andrew was a key writer of that white paper, so more of what was spoken about here you can find in that document. Of course, you can reach out to Andrew directly and sign up to our newsletter. We post plenty of blogs on information management and also other topics that are related to M365. But thank you everyone for your time, and hope you have a lovely day.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Bye.
Hope to speak soon.